My parents refused to help me because I was independent while spoiling my golden child brother. Now, they are demanding I drop everything and take care of my dying father? My parents gave my brother Caleb everything while telling me I needed to learn independence. When I was 18 and needed help with college tuition, they said, take out loans. It teaches responsibility. When Caleb turned 18 2 years later, they paid his full ride to a private university. He's not as strong as you. He needs more support, they explained. When my car broke down and I asked for help fixing it, they said, you're 23, figure it out yourself. The next week, they bought Caleb a brand new truck because his old car had a dent in it. He needs reliable transportation, they said while I took 3 buses to work. When I got married, they gave us a card with $50. When Caleb got married, they paid for the entire wedding and honeymoon. His wife comes from a poor family. Someone had to step up, they told me. I'd paid for my own wedding while eating rice and beans for 6 months. When I had my first baby and asked Mom to help for a few days, she said she couldn't get time off work. When Caleb's wife had their baby, Mom retired early to be their full-time nanny. They're struggling, she explained. They weren't struggling. Caleb made more than me but spent it on toys and trips while my parents covered his bills. When my husband lost his job and we asked for a small loan to keep our apartment, my dad said, you need to learn to save better. We can't always bail you out. We'd never asked for anything before. Meanwhile, Caleb was living in a house my parents bought him, driving cars they paid for, eating groceries they delivered weekly. He's just not good with money, Mom would say. If we don't help him, who will? Every holiday, Caleb would get expensive gifts while I got lectures about being more grateful. Every achievement I had was met with, that's nice, while Caleb's participation trophies got framed and displayed. When I graduated nursing school while working full-time and raising 2 kids, they didn't come to the ceremony. When Caleb completed an online certificate in marketing, they threw him a party. This went on for 15 years. 15 years of watching them pay Caleb's rent while I worked 3 jobs. 15 years of being told I was strong enough to handle things alone while Caleb needed support. 15 years of begging for scraps while Caleb got served everything on silver platters. Then Dad got sick. Really sick. Needed round-the-clock care, sick. Mom called me crying. We need you to move back home. Someone has to take care of Dad. I can't do it alone. I asked about Caleb. Oh, he's too busy with his job. And he doesn't have medical training like you do. Caleb's job was part-time at a gym. He spent most of his day playing video games in the house my parents bought him. But suddenly I was needed. Suddenly my strength and independence were useful. I told them I'd help, but I needed to know something first. Asked them to show me Dad's will. Mom got defensive. Why does that matter right now? But I insisted. The will left everything to Caleb. The house, the savings, the retirement accounts, everything. The reason was written right there. Our daughter has proven she can take care of herself. Our son needs continuous support. They expected me to give up my job, move my family, and become Dad's unpaid nurse while knowing they'd left me nothing, while Caleb would inherit everything I'd helped maintain. It's different, Mom tried to explain. You're successful. You don't need our money. I laughed. I'm successful because you forced me to be. Because you gave me no choice. Because every time I needed help, you told me to figure it out myself. Dad tried to speak from his bed. You were always the capable one. Caleb needed us more. No, I said. Caleb wanted more and you gave it to him. I needed you just as much, but you decided I was too strong to deserve help. I left that day. Told them to call Caleb. Told them to use all that money they'd saved by never helping me to hire a nurse. Mom called crying 2 days later. Mom's number lit up my phone screen again. I watched it buzz against the kitchen counter, the vibration making it inch toward the edge. My husband stood at the stove stirring pasta sauce, glancing over at me every few seconds. The phone went silent, then immediately started buzzing again. I reached over and declined the call. My hands were shaking as I pulled them back to my lap. He turned down the heat on the stove and walked over, putting his hand on my shoulder. I looked up at him and managed a small smile. He asked if I was okay. I told him I'd never been more sure of a decision in my life. The words came out steady, but my hands kept trembling. He squeezed my shoulder and went back to the stove. The phone stayed silent for maybe 2 minutes before it started buzzing again. I declined that call too. Then another one came through. And another. I turned the phone face down so I couldn't see Mom's name lighting up the screen over and over. By the time dinner was ready, the calls had stopped. I helped my husband set the table while my phone sat silent on the counter. We sat down to eat and I was just starting to relax when the phone buzzed once, then twice. Then it started going off like crazy with text message notifications. I got up and grabbed it, seeing dozens of messages flooding in from Mom. The first few were crying emojis and pleas to just talk to her. Then they shifted to longer paragraphs about family obligation and how she raised me better than this. I scrolled through message after message, each one getting nastier. One said I was abandoning my dying father. Another called me selfish and cruel. There was a long one about how she sacrificed everything for me, and this was how I repaid her. I opened my phone's screenshot function and started capturing every single message. I'd learned years ago to document everything when it came to my parents. Every text, every voicemail, every email got saved. My husband asked what I was doing, and I told him I was making sure I had proof of all this. He walked over and read the messages over my shoulder. I watched his face change as he scrolled through them. His jaw clenched tighter with each message. Then he got to the one where Mom called me heartless, and I felt him tense up behind me. He asked if he could see the phone, and I handed it to him. He read through all the messages, his face getting redder. When he finished, he looked angrier than I'd ever seen him in 12 years of marriage. He said he'd watched my parents treat me like garbage for over a decade. He said he was proud of me for standing up to them. His voice cracked a little when he said it. That made something break open inside me. I started crying harder than I had when Mom left those guilt-trip voicemails. But these tears felt different. They felt like relief mixed with years of hurt finally being acknowledged. He pulled me into a hug, and I sobbed into his shirt while he rubbed my back. After I calmed down, we finished dinner in quiet. My phone kept buzzing with more messages, but I ignored it. Later that evening, I called both kids into the living room. My 10-year-old sat on the couch next to my 8-year-old. They both looked worried. I sat down across from them and took a deep breath. I explained that Grandpa was very sick and needed a lot of help. I told them in simple terms that sometimes when people are sick, they need someone to take care of them all day and night. My 10-year-old asked if we were going to help take care of Grandpa. I told her that Mommy couldn't help right now. She asked why not. I explained that it was complicated, but that Grandpa had other family who could help him. My 8-year-old stayed quiet, but my 10-year-old frowned. She asked why Uncle Caleb couldn't take care of Grandpa. The question hit me like a punch to the chest. I realized my own children had noticed the unfair treatment. They'd seen how their grandparents treated their uncle differently than they treated me. I told her that was a very good question, and that Uncle Caleb should be helping. She nodded like that made sense to her. My phone rang around 9 that night. I looked at the screen and saw Caleb's name. I hadn't heard from my brother in 6 months. I answered and immediately heard panic in his voice. He demanded to know why I was abandoning the family. His tone was angry and accusatory. I actually laughed. The sound surprised even me. I asked him where he'd been for the past 15 years while I was supposedly so independent and capable. He went quiet for a second. Then he started talking over me, his voice getting louder. I interrupted him and asked if he remembered when my car broke down, and I had to take 3 buses to work. I asked if he remembered getting a brand new truck a week later. He told me that was different. I asked how it was different. He didn't have an answer. Caleb's voice changed, getting shakier. He stammered that this situation was different now. He said Dad was dying. He said I had medical training and he didn't know what to do. I let him finish his whole speech. Then I told him he could learn the same way I learned everything else in my life. I said he could figure it out completely alone without any family support. He tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. I reminded him about every time I needed help and got told to handle it myself. I brought up my wedding that I paid for while eating rice and beans for 6 months. I mentioned my first baby when Mom couldn't get time off work. He went quiet again. Then he said I was being cruel. He tried a different approach. His voice got softer, and he said Mom was falling apart. He said she couldn't handle the physical demands of taking care of Dad. He said I was the only one who could help because I was a nurse. I reminded him that Mom retired early to be his full-time nanny. I told him Mom couldn't get time off work when I had my first baby, but she could quit her job entirely for him. I asked him if he remembered that. He said that was years ago and didn't matter now. I told him it mattered to me. It had always mattered. He said I was being bitter and holding on to old grudges. I told him those old grudges were my entire life experience with our parents. He called me heartless. Then he hung up. I sat staring at my phone for a minute. Then I realized I felt better. The conversation had confirmed I was doing the right thing. My husband came into the room and asked how it went. I told him Caleb called me heartless. He shook his head and went to the kitchen. He came back with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He poured us each a glass and held his up. He said we were toasting to me putting myself first for once. I clinked my glass against his and we both drank. The wine tasted better than it should have. The next morning my phone rang while I was making coffee. I didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. A woman's voice said my name as a question. I confirmed it was me. She said this was Penelope, my dad's older sister. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She said she'd heard what was happening with my parents and Dad's illness. She said she wanted me to know something. I waited. She told me she'd always thought my parents treated me terribly compared to Caleb. Her words made my throat tight. I asked why she was calling now. She said she couldn't stay silent anymore after hearing they expected me to give up everything to care for Dad while leaving me nothing in the will. I asked how she knew about the will. She said Mom had called her crying about my refusal and let that detail slip. Penelope started telling me stories I'd never heard before. She said Dad was also the golden child in his own family growing up. She described how my grandparents enabled his irresponsibility and bailed him out of every problem. She said he never learned to handle money or take care of himself. Then he married Mom, and she took over that role from his parents. Penelope's voice got sad when she talked about watching the same pattern repeat with Caleb. She said she saw my parents doing to me and Caleb exactly what Dad's parents had done to him and Penelope. She told me the pattern was generational. She said I was right to break it. Her validation made tears spring to my eyes. I thanked her for calling. She said she should have reached out years ago, but didn't want to make things harder for me. We talked for another 20 minutes about family patterns and breaking cycles. When we hung up, I felt stronger than I had in days. I asked Penelope why she waited so long to say something. She went quiet for a second. Then she told me she tried once about 8 years ago. She said she called Mom after seeing how they treated me at Caleb's wedding. She mentioned how they spent thousands on his celebration while giving me $50 for mine. Mom got angry and told her to stay out of their parenting choices. She said they knew what was best for their kids. Dad backed Mom up and said Penelope didn't understand their family. After that, they stopped inviting her to holidays for almost 2 years. Penelope said she wanted to reach out to me directly, but worried it would make things worse for me. She figured if my parents would cut off their own sister for questioning them, they might punish me even more if they knew we talked. So she waited and hoped I would contact her first. Her words made me feel less alone than I had in years. Someone in the family actually saw what was happening and knew it was wrong. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. I started searching for home care agencies in my parents' area. The costs were high, but not impossible. A full-time nurse would run about $4,000 a month. Part-time care was cheaper, around $2,000. I made a list of 5 agencies with good reviews and reasonable rates. Then I wrote an email to Mom with all the information. I kept it simple and professional. I told her these agencies could provide the medical care Dad needed. I attached links to their websites and phone numbers. At the end, I wrote that professional care costs money, but that happens when you spend decades telling your nurse daughter she's too independent to need help. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Mom's response came 3 hours later. The subject line was just question marks. The email itself was nasty. She said I was throwing their poverty in their faces. She wrote that they weren't rich people who could afford fancy nurses. She said hired strangers couldn't provide the loving care that family should give. She accused me of being heartless and cruel during their darkest hour. She said Dad was dying and all I cared about was money and holding grudges. The email ended with her saying she never thought her own daughter would abandon her father when he needed her most. I read it twice. Then I opened a new email and started typing. I made a detailed list of every dollar I could remember them giving Caleb over 15 years. The down payment on his house was $80,000. His truck cost $35,000. His wedding and honeymoon were at least $40,000. I estimated they spent about $2,000 a month covering his bills and groceries for 10 years. That was $240,000 right there. The gifts, the bailouts, the random cash handouts probably added another $50,000 over the years. I totaled it up. $405,000 minimum. I asked Mom where all that money went. I asked why they had it for Caleb but not for Dad's care. I asked if maybe they should sell the house they bought Caleb since they needed money so badly. I sent it without a subject line. My husband found me still sitting at the table an hour later. He put his hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I showed him the emails. He read them and shook his head. Then he said something that surprised me. He suggested I talk to a therapist about all this. He said I'd been dealing with their treatment my whole life, and maybe it was time to process it with a professional. I started to say I was fine, but he stopped me. He said I'd spent so long being strong and independent that I never dealt with how much the favoritism actually hurt. He was right. I made an appointment for the following week with a therapist named Tanner who specialized in family trauma. Work became my escape. I picked up every extra shift I could get. 12-hour days turned into the norm. I worked nights, weekends, whatever was available. It was easier to care for other people's sick parents than to think about my own father dying 45 minutes away. My coworkers noticed but didn't ask questions. They just quietly adjusted the schedule to give me the hours I wanted. Taking vitals and changing IVs and checking charts kept my mind busy. The hospital felt safer than my own thoughts. 2 weeks after I refused to help, I was halfway through a shift when my phone started buzzing. My husband's name flashed on the screen. I stepped into the break room to answer. He sounded stressed. He told me Mom showed up at our house. He said she was at the front door right now crying and begging. I felt my stomach drop. I asked what she wanted. He said she wanted him to convince me to help with Dad. She kept saying Dad was asking for me. She said I was the only one who could save him. My husband told me he already said no, but she wouldn't leave. I heard Mom's voice in the background getting louder. My husband's tone changed. He told her firmly that I was done being the family's backup plan. He said they made their choices clear in their will. He said they picked Caleb over me for 15 years and now they had to live with that. He told her she needed to leave our property. Then I heard Mom start screaming. My husband said he had to go and hung up. My phone rang again immediately. It was Mom. I answered and she started yelling before I could say anything. She screamed that my husband was turning me against my own family. She said he was poisoning my mind and making me cruel. She sobbed that Dad was dying and I was letting some man control my decisions. I waited until she stopped to breathe. Then I told her my husband was the only person who consistently supported me for over a decade, while she was busy funding Caleb's lifestyle. I said he saw how they treated me and loved me anyway. I said if she ever showed up at my house unannounced again, I would get a restraining order. Mom gasped like I'd slapped her. She started crying harder and hung up. I stood in the break room staring at my phone. I waited to feel guilty or sad or something, but all I felt was relief. My first therapy session happened on a Tuesday morning. Tanner's office was small and comfortable with soft lighting and tissues on every table. He asked me to tell him why I was there. I started explaining about Dad being sick and my parents wanting me to care for him. Then I mentioned the will. Before I knew it, I was crying and telling him everything. 15 years of being told I was too capable to deserve help. Every time I needed them and got turned away. Every time Caleb got handed something I had to earn alone. I broke down describing my graduation that they skipped and Caleb's certificate party they threw. Tanner listened without interrupting. When I finally stopped talking, he said something that hit me hard. He said my parents didn't see me as strong. They saw me as less valuable than Caleb. He explained it more in the next session. He said what they did was called parentification and scapegoating. He said those were forms of abuse. He told me I wasn't obligated to set myself on fire to keep people warm who wouldn't give me a match when I was freezing. The words made something crack open inside me. I'd spent so long thinking I just needed to be strong enough or good enough or independent enough. But it was never about what I did or didn't do. They simply valued Caleb more than me. Hearing a professional say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I'd spent 15 years learning to handle everything alone. Tanner helped me see that wasn't strength my parents admired, but a burden they found convenient. 3 weeks passed before my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I answered while folding laundry in my living room. A woman's voice introduced herself as a hospital social worker named Leah. She said she was calling to discuss home care options for my father. I felt my stomach tighten. Leah explained that my mother had given her my number as the family member with medical expertise. She started listing care requirements and asking about my availability to help coordinate services. I interrupted and told her there was a mistake. I explained I wasn't involved in my father's care. Leah sounded confused. She said my mother had been very clear that I was a nurse and would be helping manage the home care situation. I told her my mother was incorrect, and that she needed to work directly with my parents for any care planning. Leah asked if there was family conflict she should be aware of. I kept my voice steady and said my parents had other family members who could help them, and that I wouldn't be participating. She thanked me and said she'd follow up with my mother to clarify. I hung up and immediately texted my mother. I told her to stop giving out my contact information, and that if she did it again, I'd file a formal complaint with the hospital. She didn't respond. 2 days later, my phone buzzed during my lunch break at work. A voicemail notification appeared. I waited until I got to my car to listen. Mom's voice came through shaky and angry. She said Dad was admitted to the hospital with pneumonia. She said his condition had gotten worse because she was too stressed to properly care for him. Her voice rose as she said the stress was my fault for abandoning the family when they needed me most. She said I was killing my own father by being selfish and cruel. She said she hoped I could live with myself when he died alone. The message ended abruptly. I sat in my car staring at my phone. My hands weren't shaking. I felt oddly calm. I saved the voicemail and made a note of the date and time. Then I forwarded it to myself in 3 different ways to make sure I had copies. My therapy appointment was the next morning. I brought my phone and played the voicemail for Tanner without any introduction. He listened with his usual calm expression. When it ended, he asked how I felt hearing it. I told him I felt relieved to have proof of what I'd been dealing with my whole life. Tanner nodded and said the voicemail was a clear example of emotional manipulation and abuse. He pointed out that blaming me for Dad's pneumonia was absurd. He said my mother was trying to make me responsible for consequences of her own choices. We spent the rest of the session talking about what kind of relationship I wanted with my parents going forward. Tanner asked if I could imagine a healthy relationship with them. I said I honestly didn't know. He told me that was okay, and that I didn't have to decide right now. He said the important thing was recognizing I had choices and that whatever I decided would be valid. That evening I was making dinner when a Facebook message notification popped up on my phone. The name surprised me. Adriana, Caleb's wife. We'd barely spoken in years beyond polite hellos at family gatherings. I opened the message while stirring pasta sauce. She said she knew things were complicated right now, but she needed to tell me something important. She said it was about Caleb and my parents' relationship. She said there were things I didn't know that might help me understand the situation better. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I stared at the message for a long time. My husband came into the kitchen and asked what was wrong. I showed him the message. He raised his eyebrows and asked if I thought it was a trap. I said I didn't know, but I was curious. I messaged back and agreed to meet her the next afternoon. The coffee shop was halfway between our houses. I arrived first and chose a table near the back. Adriana walked in 10 minutes later looking tired. She had dark circles under her eyes and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She ordered a large coffee and sat down across from me. We made awkward small talk for a minute. Then she took a deep breath and started talking. She said Caleb had been having panic attacks ever since Dad got sick. She said he'd wake up in the middle of the night hyperventilating and crying. She said he kept saying he didn't know what to do. Adriana's voice got quieter as she explained that Caleb genuinely had no idea how to handle real responsibility. She said my parents' constant enabling had left him completely unprepared for adult life. She said she'd been covering for him for years. She said she handled all their bills, scheduled all their appointments, made all their major decisions. She said she was exhausted from basically being his mother. She looked at me with red eyes and said she couldn't do it anymore. Adriana kept talking. She said something that surprised me. She admitted she'd resented me for years. She said my parents constantly compared her to me. She said every time she couldn't get Caleb to handle something, my mother would bring up how I managed everything alone. She said my father would shake his head and wonder why she couldn't be more independent like me. She said it made her feel like a failure. But she was starting to realize the favoritism had hurt both of us in different ways. She said my parents had set impossible standards by holding me up as someone who never needed help, while simultaneously making sure Caleb never had to try. She said it was messed up and unfair to everyone involved. I listened without interrupting. I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I felt sorry for Caleb. Not enough to change my boundaries, but sorry in a way I hadn't expected. I understood that being given everything had actually robbed him of something important. He never got the chance to develop real skills or self-respect. He never learned that he could handle hard things because nobody ever let him try. My parents had damaged him just as much as they'd damaged me, but in the opposite way. But I also recognized something clearly. His failure to grow up wasn't my responsibility to fix. His panic attacks and helplessness weren't my problem to solve. I'd spent 15 years being forced to be strong. He'd spent 15 years being allowed to be weak. Neither of us got what we actually needed. I told Adriana I understood what she was saying and that I was sorry she'd been caught in the middle. She nodded and wiped her eyes. Adriana asked me a direct question. She wanted to know if I had any advice for dealing with my parents' demands. She said they'd been calling her, constantly asking her to convince Caleb to step up. She said they kept guilting her about family obligation. I looked at her and told her the same thing I'd finally learned. I said the word no is a complete sentence. I said she didn't need to explain or justify or defend her boundaries. She just needed to state them and hold firm. Adriana looked scared but also hopeful. She said she'd never thought about it that way. She said she always felt like she needed a good enough reason to refuse. I told her that protecting her own well-being was reason enough. She nodded slowly, like maybe she'd been waiting for someone to give her permission to set boundaries. We talked for another hour about our shared experiences with my parents. It felt strange to bond with her after years of distance. We left the coffee shop with an understanding that we were both trying to survive the same difficult family. Dad got released from the hospital after a week. I only knew because Mom left another voicemail. Her voice sounded different this time, less angry and more desperate. She explained that the hospital had given them detailed instructions for home care. She listed things like wound management, medication schedules, and physical therapy exercises. She said the hospital social worker had strongly recommended professional nursing care. She said the social worker had concerns about the family's lack of experience with complex medical needs. Mom's voice cracked as she said they were bringing Dad home anyway, because they couldn't afford long-term hospital care. She said she was scared and didn't know if they could handle it. The message ended without asking me directly for help, but the implication was clear. My phone rang 20 minutes later while I was putting groceries away. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but I picked up. Mom started talking immediately. Her voice was shaky and desperate. She said she was calling from the hospital parking lot. She said they were about to drive Dad home. She begged me to at least come show them how to do the wound care. She said it was just one visit. She said I was a nurse and it would only take an hour. She said she was terrified of hurting Dad by doing something wrong. I listened to her beg and felt nothing but tired resolve. I told her to ask the hospital nurses for a demonstration like every other family member does. I said they provided teaching sessions for exactly this purpose. Mom started crying and said it wasn't the same as having family help. I reminded her that for 15 years they'd told me family wasn't supposed to help me. I said I'd learned to figure things out on my own, and now they could too. I hung up before she could respond. I found out Mom and Dad were bringing him home anyway through a text from Penelope that came while I was loading the dishwasher after dinner. She'd driven past their house on her way to the grocery store and saw the chaos through the front window. Caleb's truck was parked crooked in the driveway with the passenger door still open. Mom was standing on the porch gesturing wildly at something inside, while Caleb struggled with what looked like medical equipment. Penelope said it looked like they were trying to set up the hospital bed in the living room, but nobody seemed to know what they were doing. She watched for a few minutes and saw Adriana come outside twice to check instructions on her phone. Mom kept pointing at different spots in the room like she couldn't decide where the bed should go. The whole scene looked panicked and disorganized. Penelope asked if I knew they were doing this without professional help. I told her I'd recommended they hire someone, but clearly they'd decided to save money and make Caleb handle it instead. She sent me another text an hour later saying she drove by again and all the lights were on in the house, but the curtains were closed now. She said she could see shadows moving around frantically through the thin fabric. Part of me felt guilty for not being there. The other part felt vindicated that they were finally experiencing what it was like to figure things out alone without support. 4 nights later, my phone rang at 2 in the morning. I was deep asleep and the noise jolted me awake so hard my heart started racing. My husband groaned next to me and I grabbed the phone off the nightstand. Caleb's name glowed on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His voice came through panicked and shaky before I could even say hello. He was talking fast about Dad's surgical wound looking weird and oozing something yellow. He said he didn't know if that was normal or if something was really wrong. He kept asking me what he should do. I could hear Mom in the background telling him to ask me specific questions about drainage and redness. I sat up in bed and turned on the lamp. My husband rolled over and looked at me with concern. I told Caleb I wasn't his personal medical consultant and he needed to call 911 if he thought Dad was in danger. He started arguing that he just needed quick advice. I cut him off and said if the wound looked infected, then Dad needed to go to the emergency room immediately. Caleb's voice got higher and more desperate. He said he didn't want to overreact and waste money on an ambulance. And I reminded him that I'd told them weeks ago to hire professional help specifically to avoid situations like this. He kept begging me to just tell him if it sounded serious based on his description. I asked him if he would gamble with his own health this way, or if he'd go to the hospital. He went quiet for a second. Then Caleb started crying. Not just tearing up, but actually sobbing into the phone like a little kid. He said he couldn't do this anymore. He admitted he had no idea how to take care of someone this sick. His voice cracked as he said Mom and Dad had always fixed everything for him his whole life, so he never learned how to handle hard things. He said every time something went wrong, they'd swoop in and solve it before he had to deal with any real consequences. Now Dad was lying in a hospital bed in their living room with a wound that might be infected, and Caleb didn't know if he should panic, or if this was normal. He said he felt stupid and useless. Adriana's voice came through in the background telling him to just take Dad to the hospital. Caleb ignored her and kept talking to me about how he'd never had to be responsible for anything important. He said he understood now why I was so capable and independent. He said it was because I'd been forced to figure everything out alone while he got handed solutions. I felt a flash of sympathy hearing him break down like that. Part of me wanted to help him because he sounded genuinely scared and lost. But I pushed that feeling down and reminded myself that this wasn't my problem to fix. I told him I learned by being forced to figure things out alone when I was drowning and nobody threw me a life preserver. I said he could learn the same way. He needed to hang up with me and call 911 or drive Dad to the emergency room himself. Then I ended the call before he could argue more. I couldn't fall back asleep after that. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while my husband snored softly beside me. My phone stayed silent for the rest of the night. At 6 in the morning, I got up and made coffee. I checked my phone and saw a text from Mom sent at 4. It just said they'd taken Dad to the hospital and he was admitted. No other details. No apology for Caleb calling me in the middle of the night. No acknowledgement that this could have been prevented with proper care. I showed the text to my husband over breakfast, and he said they were finally learning what consequences felt like. I went to work that day and tried not to think about Dad lying in a hospital bed with an infection. One of my coworkers asked if I was okay because I seemed distracted. I told her my father was in the hospital, but I wasn't involved in his care. She gave me a weird look but didn't push for more information. 3 days later, Penelope called me during my lunch break. She'd heard from another family member that Dad was still in the hospital, and the infection was serious. The doctors had him on strong antibiotics and were monitoring him closely. Apparently, the attending physician had documented concerns about the family's ability to provide adequate home care. Penelope said this had triggered some kind of social services evaluation. She wasn't sure exactly what that meant, but she knew a social worker had gotten involved. I felt my stomach drop, even though I knew this wasn't my fault. Mom called me that evening, and I let it go to voicemail. Her message was hysterical and angry. She screamed that I'd gotten social services involved and ruined everything. She said the social worker was asking all kinds of questions about their home setup and who was providing care. She accused me of calling the hospital and reporting them for neglect. Her voice got shrill as she said I was destroying the family because I was bitter and selfish. She said Dad might not be allowed to come home because of me. The message cut off abruptly like she'd run out of time. I called her back immediately because I needed to set this straight. Mom answered on the first ring and started yelling before I could speak. I talked over her and said calmly that I didn't contact social services. I explained that the hospital did their job protecting a vulnerable patient when they saw signs of inadequate care. I told her this was the natural consequence of refusing to hire appropriate help when they knew none of them had medical training. Mom's voice got even louder. She screamed that professional care costs thousands of dollars they don't have. She said they were doing their best with what they could afford. She asked how they were supposed to pay for a private nurse when they were already struggling. I felt my jaw clench. I reminded Mom about the house they bought Caleb that probably cost $200,000. I brought up the cars they'd purchased for him over the years. I mentioned the $30,000 wedding they'd funded. I asked about the 15 years of covering his bills and delivering groceries and paying his rent. I wanted to know where all that money was now. Mom went completely silent on the other end. I could hear her breathing, but she didn't say anything for what felt like a full minute. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and hurt. She said helping family isn't supposed to be about keeping score. She said they helped Caleb because he needed it, and that's what parents do. I told her she was absolutely right. I said helping family shouldn't be about keeping score at all. I let that sit for a second before I continued. Then I said that's exactly why it's so devastating that they kept score my entire life and decided I was worth less than Caleb. I told her they'd calculated my value against his and determined I deserved nothing while he deserved everything. I said they'd been keeping a running tally of who needed what, and they'd always put their thumb on the scale in his favor. Now they wanted to claim that family shouldn't keep score when the math finally wasn't working in their favor. Mom started crying. I could hear her trying to catch her breath between sobs. She didn't say anything else. She just hung up while she was still crying. The next week, I had my regular therapy appointment with Tanner. I told him about Dad being in the hospital and the infection and the social services evaluation. I admitted I felt weird about the whole situation. Part of me felt vindicated that they were facing consequences. Another part felt guilty that Dad was suffering. Tanner asked me what I was actually feeling guilty about. I thought about it and realized I felt guilty about Dad potentially dying while we were estranged. I said I didn't know if I could live with that. Tanner nodded and said that made sense. He asked me if I thought I was responsible for Dad's current medical situation. I said no, because I'd offered solutions and they'd refused. He pointed out that I could feel sad about my father being sick without taking responsibility for the choices my parents made. He said I could grieve the father I deserve to have while still maintaining boundaries with the father I actually have. That hit me hard. I'd been thinking about it like I had to choose between having a relationship with Dad or protecting myself. Tanner helped me see those weren't the only two options. 5 weeks after I'd initially refused to help, Mom left me another voicemail. Her voice sounded different this time, less angry and more defeated. She said they'd finally hired someone, a professional home care nurse named Riker who came highly recommended. She explained they'd had to take out a reverse mortgage on their house to pay for it. She said they were essentially losing their home because I'd refused to help family when they needed me most. Her voice cracked as she talked about how they'd worked their whole lives to pay off that house, and now they were signing it away. She said she hoped I was happy with myself. She said this was all my fault for being stubborn and unforgiving. The message ended with her saying she didn't know how they'd survive financially, but at least Dad would get proper care. I saved the voicemail, but I didn't call her back. I listened to the voicemail 3 more times over the next few days, each time feeling that same uncomfortable twist in my chest. The guilt felt different from I expected. Not like I'd done something wrong, but like I was supposed to feel bad even though I knew I'd made the right choice. My next therapy appointment couldn't come fast enough. I sat down in Tanner's office and played him the voicemail before I even said hello. He listened to the whole thing, Mom's voice cracking as she talked about losing their house, the bitterness when she said it was all my fault. When it ended, Tanner looked at me and asked how I felt hearing it. I told him about the guilt, about how part of me wondered if I should have just helped to avoid all this mess. He nodded and then asked me a question I wasn't expecting. He wanted to know why my parents couldn't ask Caleb to contribute money from his income to help pay for Dad's care. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have one. Tanner pointed out that Caleb had a job, even if it was part-time. He could contribute something. My parents could have asked him to help financially instead of demanding I give up my entire life. Then Tanner brought up the house they'd bought Caleb, probably worth at least $200,000. They could sell it and use that money for Dad's care. They could ask Caleb to downsize to something he could actually afford himself. They had options that didn't involve me sacrificing everything, or them losing their home. But they'd never even considered those options because asking Caleb to contribute or give something up wasn't in their playbook. I sat there feeling the guilt drain away, replaced by something clearer and stronger. The next afternoon, my phone rang with Penelope's name on the screen. I picked up and she sounded shaken, her voice tight like she'd been crying. She told me she'd just left my parents' house and I needed to know what happened. Caleb had shown up while she was there visiting Dad. My parents had apparently been pressuring him harder about helping with care, now that they'd hired Riker and were facing the financial reality. Caleb had walked into the living room where Dad was sleeping in his hospital bed, where Mom and Penelope were sitting, and he'd just broken down. Not angry yelling like I'd heard from him before. Complete breakdown, sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe, collapsing into a chair with his head in his hands. Penelope said she'd never seen a grown man fall apart like that. He kept saying over and over that he didn't know how to do anything, that he was useless, that Mom and Dad had ruined him. He said they'd never let him struggle or fail or figure anything out on his own, and now he was 35 years old and couldn't handle basic adult responsibilities. He said watching them scramble to find care for Dad made him realize how much they'd crippled him by always swooping in to fix everything. Mom had tried to comfort him, telling him that wasn't true, but Caleb had pushed her away. He'd said she needed to stop, that she needed to let him figure out his own life even if he failed. Penelope's voice got quieter as she told me that watching it was painful, but she also thought maybe it was the wake-up call Caleb needed. Maybe hitting rock bottom was the only way he'd start to climb back up. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt vindicated that Caleb was finally seeing what I'd been trying to tell everyone. Another part felt sad for him, for the person he could have been if our parents hadn't smothered him with help he never needed. 2 days later, I got a text from Adriana. It was long, the kind that clearly took her time to write. She said she and Caleb had their first marriage counseling appointment scheduled for next week. She told me she couldn't keep carrying him the way his parents had, that she was exhausted from compensating for all the things he never learned to do. She said she loved him, but she couldn't be his mother and his wife at the same time. The text ended with something that surprised me. She thanked me for modeling what healthy boundaries look like. She said watching me stand firm with my parents, even when they pressured and guilted me, showed her that it was possible to say no to people you love. She admitted she was scared to implement those boundaries with Caleb, terrified of what might happen to their marriage if she stopped enabling him, but she knew it was necessary. I read the text 3 times, feeling something shift in how I saw Adriana. I'd always thought of her as part of the problem, someone who went along with my parents' favoritism because it benefited her. But she was trapped in the same cycle, just from a different angle. I texted her back, telling her I was proud of her for taking that step. I said setting boundaries was terrifying, but it was also the only way to build relationships based on respect instead of obligation. 6 weeks after I'd walked out of my parents' house and told them to call Caleb, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was a spam call. But something made me pick up. Mom's voice came through and it sounded different from I'd ever heard it. Smaller. Older. Tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. She asked if we could talk in person, just the two of us, without fighting. She said she knew she didn't deserve it, but she was asking anyway. I stood in my kitchen, staring out the window at my kids playing in the backyard, and felt my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect myself from more hurt. But another part, the part that Tanner had been helping me develop in therapy, knew I'd regret it if I didn't at least try. I told her yes. We agreed on a coffee shop halfway between our houses, neutral territory where neither of us had the home advantage. After I hung up, my husband came into the kitchen and asked who'd called. I told him about Mom's request and watched his face go through several emotions. He asked if I wanted him to come with me for support. I thought about it for a long minute. Having him there would make me feel safer, more confident. But I also knew I needed to do this alone. I needed to prove to myself that I was strong enough to face my mother without backup, that I could hold my boundaries even when it was just the two of us. I told him I needed to go alone, but I appreciated the offer more than he knew. The coffee shop was busy when I arrived, full of people on laptops and groups of friends chatting. I spotted Mom immediately at a corner table. She looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her hair was unwashed, pulled back in a messy ponytail. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. When she saw me, she stood up halfway like she wasn't sure if she should hug me or stay seated. I made the decision for her by sitting down across from her without any greeting beyond a nod. We sat in awkward silence for a moment before Mom started talking. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, so different from the demanding tone I was used to. She apologized for showing up at my house unannounced. She apologized for the nasty voicemails, for the guilt trips, for putting me in an impossible position. She said she was sorry for making me feel like I had to choose between taking care of Dad and respecting myself. I listened, waiting, because I knew Mom well enough to know the but was coming. It came exactly when I expected. Her face shifted slightly, and she said that I had to understand they were just trying to help Caleb, because he needed it more. The words came out almost automatically, like she couldn't help herself. I interrupted her before she could continue. I told her that wasn't an apology. That was a justification. That was her explaining why she thought it was okay to treat me like I was worth less than Caleb my entire life. I said if she couldn't see the difference between apologizing and justifying, then we didn't have anything to talk about. Mom's face started to crumple. Her eyes filled with tears and her mouth trembled. She looked down at her coffee cup, at her hands wrapped around it, anywhere but at me. After a long silence, Mom spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. She admitted that maybe she did treat me unfairly. She said she thought I was so capable, so strong, that I didn't need the same support Caleb needed. She said she was trying to prepare me for the real world while protecting Caleb from it. I leaned forward and looked directly at her until she met my eyes. I told her that being capable wasn't the same as not needing love. It wasn't the same as not needing support or basic fairness from your parents. I said she'd mistaken my survival skills for not needing a family, and that was her failure, not my strength. I told her that every time I succeeded despite her lack of help, she'd used it as proof that she'd been right to withhold help in the first place. It was a self-fulfilling cycle where my competence justified her neglect. Mom was fully crying now, tears running down her face as she tried to wipe them away with a napkin. She asked me what she could do to fix this, her voice breaking. I sat back and thought about how to answer honestly. I told her I didn't know if it could be fixed. I said 15 years of damage doesn't heal from one conversation in a coffee shop. I said I'd spent my entire adult life being told I wasn't worth investing in, and that kind of hurt doesn't disappear, because she finally acknowledged it. But then I told her I was willing to try. I said if she was serious about understanding what she did wrong, really serious and not just trying to get me to help with Dad, then I'd agree to family therapy. Together. Where a professional could help us work through everything. Mom nodded quickly, desperately, saying yes to anything I wanted. Then she asked if I'd visit Dad now. Her voice got even smaller as she said they could start rebuilding while there was still time. I felt my jaw tighten. I told her I'd think about it. But I needed her to understand something first. Any relationship going forward, with her or with Dad, would be on my terms with firm boundaries. I wouldn't be manipulated or guilted. I wouldn't be the family's backup plan or unpaid nurse. If they wanted me in their lives, it would be as an equal daughter, not as the strong one who didn't need anything. Mom nodded again, wiping her eyes. She said she understood, that she'd do whatever it took. I stood up to leave, feeling emotionally exhausted but also lighter somehow. Like I'd finally said things I'd needed to say for years. My husband's arms wrapped around me in the parking lot, and I just let myself cry. The kind of crying where you can't catch your breath and your whole body shakes. He didn't say anything, just held me while other coffee shop customers walked past us to their cars. I felt completely empty, but also somehow lighter, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I didn't notice the weight until I finally put it down. We sat in his truck for 20 minutes before I could pull myself together enough to go home. My kids were at my sister-in-law's house, and the quiet when we got home felt strange and peaceful. I took a long shower and cried some more under the hot water, washing away years of hurt that I'd been holding inside. A week later, I called Mom and told her I'd visit Dad. My voice shook when I explained the rules. I was coming as his daughter, not as his nurse, and I could leave whenever I needed to. Mom agreed immediately and promised Caleb wouldn't be there so it wouldn't be too much all at once. My husband offered to come with me, but I needed to do this alone. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I almost turned around 3 times but kept going. When I pulled into their driveway, I sat in my car for 5 minutes trying to breathe normally before going inside. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her face pale and tired. She hugged me and I let her, feeling stiff and awkward in her arms. The house smelled different, like medicine and something else I couldn't name. She led me to the living room where they'd set up a hospital bed. Dad looked so much smaller than I remembered, his skin gray and his breathing loud through the oxygen tubes in his nose. Riker, the nurse they'd hired, was checking Dad's blood pressure. He looked up when we came in and gave me a professional smile. He told Mom that Dad's vitals were stable and left us alone, closing the door quietly behind him. Dad's eyes opened when he heard us, and he started crying the moment he saw me. His hand reached out toward me, shaking badly. He kept saying he was sorry, that he understood now why I'd refused to help. I moved closer and sat in the chair beside his bed, my heart beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. I took his hand carefully and told him I was sorry he was sick, but I wasn't sorry for protecting myself and my family. He nodded and kept crying, his tears running down into the oxygen tubes. Mom stood by the door watching us, her hand covering her mouth. Dad's voice came out weak and raspy as he told me about Caleb's breakdown. He said watching Caleb fall apart made him realize what they'd done to both of us. They'd hurt Caleb by never letting him learn to handle anything hard, and they'd hurt me by making me handle everything alone. He said the will was wrong and he'd already called his attorney to change it. His hand squeezed mine and more tears ran down his face. He looked old and small and nothing like the father I remembered who used to tell me I was strong enough to figure things out myself. I pulled my hand back and told him to stop talking about the will. My voice came out harder than I meant it to. I said this wasn't about money or inheritance. It was about being treated like I mattered as much as Caleb did. Dad nodded and his crying got worse. He said he wished he could go back and do everything different, that he was proud of who I became despite them, not because of how they raised me. The words hung in the air between us, and I didn't know what to say back. Mom walked over and put her hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged it off. I needed space to process what Dad was saying. We talked for over an hour about my childhood. I brought up specific times when I'd needed them, and they'd chosen Caleb instead. The time I'd asked for help with my car, and they bought Caleb a truck the next week. The time I'd graduated nursing school, and they didn't come, but threw Caleb a party for finishing an online certificate. The time my husband lost his job, and they said no to a small loan but kept paying Caleb's bills. Dad listened to each one and acknowledged them, sometimes just nodding, sometimes crying harder. It didn't erase the hurt or fix what they'd done, but it was something. It was more than I'd ever gotten from them before. I stood up to leave and told Dad I'd visit again next week. My legs felt shaky, and I had to hold on to the chair for a second. I said we could try to build whatever relationship was possible in the time he had left, but I couldn't promise anything more than that. Dad nodded and thanked me for coming, his voice barely a whisper. Mom walked me to my car and kept thanking me for giving them a chance to make partial amends. I didn't correct her use of the word partial. We both knew nothing could fully make up for 15 years of treating me like I was worth less than my brother. Over the next month, I visited Dad every week. I kept my boundaries firm about not being his nurse and not getting involved in his medical care beyond what any daughter would do. Mom started going to therapy on her own, which surprised me. We began family counseling sessions together that were painful and hard, but also helped us talk about things we'd never discussed before. The therapist made Mom acknowledge specific ways she'd treated me unfairly. Some sessions I left feeling worse than when I arrived, but I kept going back. My husband kept asking if I was okay, and I honestly didn't know how to answer him. The estate attorney called me on a Tuesday morning while I was at work. He explained that Dad had changed his will to split everything equally between Caleb and me. He read me the new language that acknowledged the previous will was based on wrong reasoning about my supposed independence. I listened to the whole thing and then told him I appreciated the gesture, but my priority was the relationship with my parents, not the inheritance. The attorney sounded confused by my response, like he'd expected me to be happy about the money. I hung up and went back to work, taking care of other people's sick parents while trying to figure out how I felt about my own. Caleb texted me 2 weeks after that visit with Dad, asking if we could meet somewhere neutral to talk. I stared at the message for a long time before agreeing to meet him at a park near my house where I could leave whenever I wanted. He showed up looking thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes that reminded me of how Mom looked at the coffee shop. We sat at a picnic table and he started talking before I could say anything. He told me he'd been seeing a therapist twice a week since his breakdown, and was finally understanding how messed up our childhood was. He said he knew I was treated unfairly, and he took advantage of it even when he knew it was wrong. His voice cracked when he admitted he'd convinced himself he deserved everything, because Mom and Dad kept telling him he needed more support. He said watching Dad get sicker made him realize he didn't know how to do anything real or hard because they'd never let him struggle. Caleb told me about trying to manage Dad's medications and failing completely, about Adriana threatening to leave him if he didn't grow up, about realizing at 35 years old that he had no actual life skills. He apologized for every time he'd gotten something I'd been denied, for never speaking up when they treated me like I was worth less, for calling me bitter and heartless when I refused to be their nurse. I listened without interrupting, and felt something shift inside me that wasn't forgiveness exactly, but maybe understanding. He asked if we could try to build some kind of relationship as adults, instead of as the golden child and the scapegoat. I told him I'd think about it and that any relationship would require him to actually change, not just apologize. We sat there for another hour talking about specific memories from our childhood, and he acknowledged things I'd thought only I noticed. When I left, I felt lighter than I had in years. Dad's condition got worse over the next few months despite Riker's excellent care and multiple hospital stays. Mom called me one Tuesday morning in early spring and told me Dad was declining fast, and the doctors said it would be days, maybe a week at most. I drove to their house and found Dad barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Caleb was already there, sitting in the corner looking lost and scared. Mom asked if I'd stay, and I nodded, calling my husband to bring the kids by later to say goodbye. The three of us took turns sitting with Dad over the next 2 days while Riker managed his pain medications and kept him comfortable. Dad woke up a few times and seemed to recognize us but couldn't really talk anymore. On the third day, his breathing changed and Riker quietly told us it wouldn't be much longer. Mom sat on one side of the bed holding Dad's left hand, while I held his right hand. Caleb stood at the foot of the bed with tears running down his face. Dad's breathing got slower and slower until it just stopped. Mom started crying, and I found myself crying too, even though I'd thought I was prepared for this. Riker checked for a pulse and confirmed Dad was gone, then gave us privacy to sit with him. I looked at Dad's face, peaceful now without the pain that had twisted it for months, and felt glad I'd come back for these final weeks. It didn't fix what they'd done to me growing up, but at least I wouldn't spend the rest of my life wondering if I should have been there. Mom squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you," and I squeezed back without saying anything. The funeral happened 5 days later at the same church where my parents got married 40 years ago. Extended family came from 3 different states, and the place was packed with people I hadn't seen in years. Aunt Penelope sat with me and my family in the front row, while Mom and Caleb sat on the other side of the aisle. During the reception at Mom's house, relatives kept pulling me aside to talk privately. Dad's brother told me he'd always thought I got a raw deal compared to Caleb, but didn't know how to bring it up. Mom's sister admitted she'd argued with Mom years ago about the unfair treatment, and got cut off for 6 months. 3 different cousins mentioned noticing how my achievements were ignored while Caleb's were celebrated. Each conversation felt like validation that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated the favoritism. Penelope gave a short speech during the service about Dad's life, and ended it by talking about the importance of treating all children with equal love and respect. She didn't mention our family specifically, but everyone who knew the situation understood what she meant. Mom cried harder during that part, and Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. I watched them and felt sad for all of us, for the family we could have been if they'd just treated us fairly. After everyone left, I helped Mom clean up while Caleb took out trash bags. We worked together without talking much, and it felt strange but not terrible. Mom hugged me before I left and told me she was grateful I came back when it mattered. I told her I was glad I did too. 6 months passed and everything changed slowly, instead of all at once like I'd expected. Mom and I kept going to therapy together every other week, and the sessions got easier, as we learned how to talk about the past without her getting defensive. She started acknowledging specific ways she'd failed me without adding justifications about Caleb needing more support. We'd never be as close as some mothers and daughters, but we were building something real based on honesty, instead of pretending everything was fine. Caleb actually followed through on changing his life in ways that surprised me. He got a full-time job at a physical therapy clinic and started paying his own bills with Adriana's firm support. They sold the house Mom and Dad bought him and moved into a smaller place they could afford on their own income. He texted me every few weeks with updates about learning to cook or fixing something in his house without calling for help. I started inviting him and Adriana to family dinners once a month, and watching him interact with my kids like a normal uncle, instead of someone who'd been handed everything. The inheritance got split equally like Dad changed it too, and I put my half into college funds for my kids and retirement savings. I found peace with my decision to walk away until my parents were ready to treat me right, because it taught my kids something important. I tell them all the time that love shouldn't require you to make yourself smaller, that family is about mutual respect and support, not just shared DNA. I teach them that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is set boundaries and walk away until people are ready to see your worth. They watch me maintain my relationship with Mom and Caleb on my terms, and learn that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or accepting bad treatment. My husband tells me he's proud of how I handled everything, and I finally believe I did the right thing by choosing myself first.